Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the panel session on strengthening domestic financial systems and institutions to scale up private finance of the GPIC 2021. My name is Leo, and I'm with the private sector facility of the Green Climate Fund, leading our engagement with the financial institutions, central banks, and other relevant financial actors with an aim to greening the financial system for climate. I'm very grateful to have our distinguished speakers and moderator today. And the purpose of this session is to tackle the different roles the financial stakeholders can play to contribute to the strengthening of the domestic financial systems and institutions to scale up private finance. Representatives from central banks, local banking sector, international, public, and commercial financial institutions will try to answer this question. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We'd like to invite you to submit your written questions or comments in the event platform Hoover. Live remote interpretation to French and Spanish is available. Participants are invited to select the language in which they'd like to follow the entire session by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of the streaming window. Automated live captioning is available to several languages. Please note the link in the session description within Hoover. Full video recording of the session will be available on Hoover after the session and later also on the event webpage. We sincerely hope that you will find this session useful. And again, we invite you to submit your questions and comments in writing through the Q&A function on Hoover. I'll now hand back the floor to Lamia, who will be moderating the session and proceed with the program. Thanks, Lamia.
Thank you, Leo. Good morning for some and good evening to others. Welcome to this panel session on strengthening domestic financial systems and institutions to scale up private finance. My name is Lamia Merzouki, and I'm joined by very inspiring speakers from the sustainable finance world. Eric Usher, head of UNEP-FI, Paul Bodner, global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, Jean Boissineau, head of secretariat at the NGFS and deputy director financial stability at Banque de France, Pa Ousmane Jarjour, former Gambian Minister of Environment and director at the GCF, and last but not least, Luan Sieh, senior managing director, head of group sustainability at CIMB. So as Leo Park mentioned right now, the purpose of this session is to tackle the different roles the financial stakeholders could play to contribute to the strengthening of domestic financial systems to scale up private finance. So let's kick things off. Actually, in a few weeks, the actors of the sustainable world will be meeting in Glasgow. And over the past few years at the different COP conferences, we have heard a lot of positive things, but a lot of them remain at the stage of promises. And today, time for action has come and accountability becomes crucial. So we must move on to real commitments with real impact. Today, our panel is divided into 3 key points. The first one is about the role of the financial stakeholders in accelerating the transition towards sustainable finance. The second is about how the international and domestic financial communities can help countries address market and capacity gaps to accelerate this transition. And the last one is more technical. It is about the financial vehicles to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the UN SDGs. Moving on to our first key point, I suggest that we have a tour de table where each one can talk about his or her perspective on the role of stakeholders, be it regulators or private players, in accelerating the transition. I'll start with you, Eric, as the head of UNEP-FI, where you have focused on accelerating the deep integration of sustainability risks into financial practice. I mean, you have today more of a general overview on sustainable finance. So what is your opinion on this and how can we go from promises to concrete actions?
Thanks very much, Lamia, and thank you, Leo and Paulisman and colleagues from GCF and the opportunity to take part. So credibility of action is definitely the name of the game as we go into to Glasgow, and that certainly applies to countries, governments, their ambition, but also the private sector and other non-state actors. The finance industry, is it a change taker or a change maker? Is it going to help lead the transition? Is it going to enable the transition? Is it going to maybe slow that transition down? And in our belief, within the networks of the actions we do across the banking, insurance, and investment industries, we believe there's a strong case for financial institutions to be leaning in. Whether just because they lean in does not mean that regulation and certainly policies aren't needed. We believe that that's a misunderstood messaging today. If regulation is needed, and often it will be, leaning in voluntarily from the private sector helps get the ball rolling, we can say. And we're seeing a lot of that forward ambition happening today. UNIPFI is the host or the convener of a number of the net zero alliances for asset owners, for insurers, insurance underwriting, and for banking. And I would just like to focus in on the banking net zero alliance, because it's actually very quickly becoming very large. It's also, the role of banking in this transition is, there's a lot of criticism out there today, and a lot of it comes down to credibility of action. We believe we're seeing a real mobilization. Part of the reason I want to talk about banking as well is because within emerging markets and developing countries is particularly relevant. We've been working with this for the longest with the asset owners, and they've made a lot of progress. And actually tomorrow they will issue a major progress report, which gives a lot of detail to what they're doing. But it's still a more northern agenda. As we know, in developing countries, banks are still the largest intermediary of financing, and therefore their involvement is critical. The Net Zero Banking Alliance today, it's actually at 90 members, accounting for over a third of global banking assets. This is for something that started in April of this year. So in only a number of months, the banking industry has significantly gone on board with this, we could say this ambition. But the question is really what's under the hood in terms of what are they signing up to? It's important to say who's there. The 10 largest European banks, the 9 largest North American banks, the 7 largest Latin American banks, and I've lost track in Asia, but a number of big actors with largest banks in Korea, in Malaysia, in places like Kenya and Egypt and Brazil and Mexico. So there are a lot of significant emerging market developing country banking institutions who are seeing this agenda as being something they need to really help drive. The biggest reason for that, I believe, is because their clients, their customers are themselves realizing that they're under threat and that they need to figure out how they're going to navigate the transition, the role of banking and other financial service providers in helping them get there. So I won't go into the details, but I could come back a little bit later to say, what does it mean to sign up to these commitments? I think it's quite important to say that they have to be science-based, based on the IPCC, IEA, or other scenarios that are well regarded. They need to rely on no overshoot or low overshoot scenarios. So we're not looking for a dream solution that's going to come in the 2040s to get us out of this crunch. They need to rely conservatively on the negative emission technologies and carbon offsetting really only to deal with the really technologically difficult sectors, maybe like aviation, where it's going to be hard to come up with solutions that are net zero quick enough. Banks who sign up have 18 months to issue their first targets in high emissions intensity areas, and they need to do this on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions areas wherever significant on their portfolio. So I think the final point then is we do see the banking industry stepping up like other parts of the financial sector. I think they're very ambitious. We need the Paris rulebook to make sure what they do is credible, and very significantly coming to the role of the GCF and other in the development finance community, we need to help them get there because those will be huge, significant changes in how they do business. And I think the global community really has a collective responsibility to make sure that they can succeed. Thank you, Lamia. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for these insights. Let us lean in and be a change maker. So my next question is for Luan, being the head of sustainability in a bank in an emerging market, in this case, CIMB Group, one of ASEAN's leading banking groups, where you are responsible for transforming the bank into a shaper of sustainable finance and responsible banking practices in Asia. Can you tell us what is the perspective of a developing country on how to accelerate this transition?
Thank you, Lamia. So CIMB is based out of ASEAN, and we're headquartered in Kuala Lumpur. We're a medium to small bank, 150 billion US in assets. But one of the things that we've realized pretty early on is that sustainability is really something that we cannot ignore. You know, Eric mentioned that sustainability is still very much a northern agenda, and we see that. But the developing countries cannot sit aside and wait for things to happen. And the regulators are now very much in ASEAN waking up and really pushing the agenda. I mean, 3 years ago, when CIMB started looking at sustainability, it was nowhere. And all of a sudden, in the last 2 years, the regulators have started putting in taxonomies, they have started putting in regulations, and all of a sudden, it's flying. But what are some of the issues? We as a bank in ASEAN, we operate in 10 different countries in ASEAN, and there are 10 different taxonomies, or there will be 10 different taxonomies. How do we reconcile that? Capacity building is a major issue as well. So regulators really need to, help on that front. And I must say, because we are a part of UNEP-FI and the Principles for Responsible Banking, joining a global group like the PRB has really, really helped. So I think what is needed is for the regulators to get up to speed and really, really push the agenda even further than they have been. And the banks will follow. That's when we see the acceleration. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting perspective, Luan. I mean, without harmonized frameworks and clear taxonomies, we cannot mobilize green investment flows and investors are lost. So moving on to Jean. Jean, you are the head of secretariat at the NGFS and deputy director, financial stability at Banque de France. Over the course of your career, you have been involved in a number of international groups like the G20, FSB, OECD, and so on. What can you tell us about the tangible actions that you have undertaken within these international groups, and how can your work help the appropriate actors to accelerate this transition?
Thank you, Lamia. I'll focus on the NGFS. Although, as you said, I mean, you mentioned the FSB, you mentioned the OECD. I mean, it's quite clear that the international bodies have, and the G20 and the G7. I mean, the international bodies have woken up to the climate urgency in the past year and a half, and we are now discussing climate everywhere. To be honest, when we started the NGFS 4 years ago, it was not like that. And what I can say is that the endeavor of the NGFS was basically to be a catalyst for action. It was central bank and supervisors realizing that these questions are very difficult, being very mindful, as Luan just said, that we need to work together to avoid the F word, fragmentation. Everybody could have gone in its own direction because the problem is so difficult that depending on where you start from, you may end up in very different places. So the NGFS has been this collaborative platform to develop a number of things that are designed to facilitate the climate action of central bank and supervisors. It is, for example, the work that has been done in collecting the best practices with respect to supervising climate and environmental risk, for example. And we will be publishing next week a progress report against that illustrates, how how far and how fast things have been moving in the past year since we first put out the how-to guide to supervise this risk. Just today, an hour and a half ago, we published a report, Scenario in Actions, which is a synthesis of basically how the NGFS members have used the NGFS scenarios to inform scenario-based risk assessment and climate stress test and the like. So what we've been collectively doing is equipping ourselves with tools to be able to get serious to the climate business. And as you said, or as some have said, there's a lot of energy in our group. I mean, the same kind of energy. Maybe it's not visible in the same way as the ones that Eric was mentioning, but there's a lot of energy and in search for the right approach to these questions. And my last point would be that this collaboration is not a southern, northern, western, eastern, whatever. It's a very global effort. We are 95 members and counting now from all over the place. We collectively supervise all the GSIBs, 2/3 of the globally systemically important insurers. It's 85% of the GHG emission that are emitted in the jurisdiction in which we operate. So we are getting in a place where we are starting to make a contribution to this whole transition.
Awesome, Jean. Happy to hear that there is a lot of collective energy. Let me turn to Pa. You are the director of the GCF's Country Programming Division, former Gambian Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Natural Resources, and former chair of the Least Development Countries Group to the UNFCCC. So, Pa, in what way do you help at the GCF different countries with their transition to a more sustainable financial system?
Thank you for this very important question. As you know, the GCF, through our Readiness Preparatory Support Program, do provide capacity building to both institution and also policy and strategic frameworks. And you know that strong institutional and policy framework are critical towards identifying transformational investment opportunities. And what we do in the financial system is to support countries through their central bank, financial institutions, commercial banks, to develop not only the banking regulatory systems, but also looking at environmental and risk management frameworks. For instance, with Bangladesh, we have supported the central bank and other financial institutions to develop a Sharia-based green banking framework through which capacity building could also be done, and then they would develop a framework and a manual that would ensure that all the regulators and also the banks would be trained on climate financing. And we know that Islamic banking is very key in Bangladesh and some of the neighboring countries like Pakistan, Maldives, and Indonesia. But lack of resources and particular regulatory frameworks in green banking has been an impediment in green financing. So we think these are the ways of supporting countries really bring in the private sector in particular, and also small and medium-sized enterprises to really access green financing. So the policy framework is key. The environmental and social risk management frameworks are also fundamental in addition to the capacity building. And in the case of Bangladesh, they are going to develop a hub, a financial training hub, through which they can also share lessons and experiences with other Islamic banking institutions in their neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pa, for sharing with us those experiences in different countries. Of course, we need to support and assist those countries with building human as well as institutional capacity, clearly. So now moving on to our second key point, which is about how international and domestic financial communities can help countries address market and capacity gaps to accelerate the transition to a climate-compatible financial systems. Paul, you are the global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, with an extensive experience in sustainable finance at the RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, but also under the Obama administration as special assistant to the president and senior director for energy and climate change at the National Security Council. So how are you working with the international or regional community towards achieving sustainable finance objectives?
Thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to be part of this distinguished group. It's great to see the GCF continue to grow and flourish, having been involved in 10 years ago when we were designing it and getting it up and running. So congratulations for all that you've already achieved on behalf of the global community. I think when we look at what it's going to take to really support decarbonization in emerging markets in particular, there's obviously a lot of work underway. 1,000 flowers have bloomed. Lots of climate funds now exist. The GCF, of course, but many regional, thematic, bilateral programs. And increasingly, I think countries are getting support to navigate that complex landscape, which is something that Pa and I have talked about a lot as a separate issue. I think the challenge that exists in the emerging markets context in particular is that the range of strategies that we are currently employing are not necessarily designed to work at speed. So the gradual scale up of first of its kind projects that the GCF might support in different markets, the first LED lighting program, the first rapid bus transit program, the first commercial renewable energy project in country X and Y, with the hope that then local financial institutions learn about it, become more familiar about it. That is the right approach, and it's hard work everywhere, but it is difficult to see it scaling at a speed that is consistent with the need to reduce global emissions by half in the course of this decade. Similarly, the focus on improving enabling environments and providing capacity building assistance to countries so that they can better attract private investment is very important, but it is going to take a long time. And so you can't wave your wand and then say that countries are suddenly investment grade and private capital will pour in. That's not the way it works. And the issues that, let's say, many people who might attend this conference would be focused on, climate-specific enabling environment factors, are not necessarily the things that are holding back private capital to invest where it's needed. It's broader issues that are not specific to climate, but relate to legal, political, macroeconomic conditions that are gradually being improved around the world, but it just takes time. And then finally is the challenge that, as you know better than anyone in the GCF private sector facility, it is hard to get public and private financial institutions to work together. They just do not speak the same language. It is tough to align incentives. Deals that blend public and private are painful, labor intensive, and hard to scale. And that is why there's a relatively abysmal leverage ratio between public and private finance today, and there always has been. So we need to really think outside the box and not just use the usual playbook here of gradually, pilot projects and demonstration projects on the one hand, and gradually chiseling away at enabling environments on the other hand. And one solution that I think is very promising, and I know Leo has worked very hard on, is the establishment of national green investment banks, which shift the focus and ownership of climate finance to the national level where it belongs. And I think break this narrative that we can decarbonize entire economies through a straw by pushing climate finance from north to south. That is not the way this is going to happen in practice. And so moving the locus of control to the national level, creating innovative, publicly owned, commercially operated financial institutions that are focused on the green transition is something that is unfolding in a lot of emerging economies and developed economies today, and I think can make a huge difference.
Brilliant, Paul. Thank you very much for pointing that out, and all the innovative solutions that you mentioned. Getting back to you, Jean, what are some ways in which you are working to close market and capacity gaps?
I think, as I said, providing the tools that the collectivity or the community can use is an important one. But indeed, you need the capacity to start with, and that's something we realized a while ago, and we have joined forces with a few other organizations, and among them, most prominently, the Bank for International Settlements, to set up what we have called the Climate Training Alliance, which is a way for all the NGFS members and the wider community in the central banking and supervisory world to basically enable or allow anyone else to leverage on what the institution is doing with respect to training. If we train people here at the Banque de France or in any other central bank, for example, of the network, if there is a spare capacity, it is most welcome to be used by someone else in the community. And when we say about spare capacity, I should have said things that come at a zero marginal cost. And when in the world we are living in right now, webinars and the like is clearly something that you can deploy at a larger scale than the institution itself. So we are trying to basically accelerate that by avoiding everyone having to tackle this on its own. Going beyond that, obviously, training, technical assistance, for example, is something we are starting to discuss with the organization that are in the business of providing technical assistance, the World Bank, the IMF, and the like, and it's something that will need to complement this training. But providing the basic training, making sure that in the organization, because we want to streamline this climate consideration all across the organization, making sure that everybody has a good understanding of what is it exactly that we are facing, and what is exactly the strategy that we are pursuing in addressing this question, is something that is maybe as critical as having the good strategy.
Great. The launch of the Climate Training Alliance is great news, and I hope it helps change things. I will turn to you, Luan. In your opinion, how has the international community as well as your government helped you in this transition?
So coming from the global south, developing markets, climate funding is something that we very much look forward to. And in many of our markets, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, there is a lot of funding. But there are also these countries kind of in the middle who are not least developed, but they're kind of higher middle income, like Malaysia, like Thailand. The countries like these are finding it really difficult to get international funding because we're just not, we're not in the extremes. And I get that, but I think there is a lot of demand for international funding in these countries, and I think that's an area that's being overlooked. I think the other thing is something that the other panelists have mentioned, which is capacity building and technical assistance. There is a lot of kind of demand and willingness to participate in the local markets, but the banks are just looking at themselves, they're looking at the regulators, but nobody has that kind of knowledge and experience in international and blended finance. So what the global players are looking for and what the local players can provide, I think there's a gap, and somehow that gap needs to be closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Again, capacity building is key, but we need to have an alignment, and it's key even to rally all the stakeholders. Eric, I'm curious to know what the UNEP-FI is doing in this regard.
Thanks, Lemia. Let me try to propose a 6-point plan for, I think, what is needed, and ties together some of the speakers' comments. One, we need green finance innovation, and we've been getting a lot of that, particularly since 2015. There's a lot of great instruments out there, but as Paul said, not at scale yet. Two, we need the regulators on board. And as Jean has said, there's been a huge uptake in terms of regulators and supervisors. However, what regulators and supervisors talk about is not really green instruments. It's more about the whole of how a bank operates or other financial actor. So three, once you have the regulators on board, then you need this transformation embedded in bank governance and strategy, so that it's not one small green department alongside a whole lot of other non-green business as usual departments. It's something that is, in that essence, is top down. You're embedding this in the direction of the organization. Four, then you need, and what we're seeing with the banks and the net zero banks we're working with, like CIMB, is how do you start to understand all the industries you work in, like cement and steel and buildings and energy and transport and agriculture, and how do we understand what sectoral pathways will be to get them to net zero and get them to climate resilience, and what sort of financing will be required, working not only with new startups with great new ideas, but also with the incumbents. Because if we can't turn the core of the economy today, including by changing those who are causing a lot of the pollution today, it's maybe a little bit wishful thinking that we can do it just with green innovations. Five, capacity. You can't do it just with a plan. You need to actually have the teams, and this is no longer one team, it's across the organization, and there's a huge amount of capacity development that's needed. And then six, to Paul's point, scale. That this basically positions the finance industry, and I'm talking a lot about banking, but not only, that then you're in a position to do it in a holistic sense, because this is all about what the bank is going to do, rather than, oh, we need a green department, but everything else stays the same. Final point, the relationship between commercial financial actors and DFIs or IFIs or MDBs. It's a really critical one. I think we have to acknowledge in some markets, commercial actors stay away because they feel pushed out of the market. And I think that's something we're all familiar with. So we really have to think carefully about how do you blend in a way that actually brings these actors in. And I don't personally believe in the model that development banks should go to the capital markets and basically do all the financing on the ground. The role of development banks is to help get the financial industry, mostly commercial, ramped up to be able to solve the problem. And that's one of the scale issues, because development banks will never have the scale that the commercial financial actors do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for this brilliant 6-point plan addressing the core economy in a holistic way. That's really, really inspiring. Finally, we are getting to the third key point of the day. So let's talk about some innovative financial vehicles that could accelerate the alignment of the financial systems. Pa, I'm curious to know how the GCF could support the establishment of such vehicles in developing countries. And I'd like you to talk concretely, on the ground. What are some actions that you are working on in this regard?
Thank you for this question. As you know, high lending interest rates have been a constraint, and the short tenor have also been a constraint for financial institutions to access financing. And what the GCF does is to support in creating such vehicles. And to give you an example, in the case of Mongolia, we've supported the government of Mongolia to establish Mongolia Green Finance Corporation as a financing vehicle that would inject and provide financial resources to the participating financial institutions for energy efficiency in industry and also businesses, and also for insulation and mortgages for housing. And this is in the form of concessional financing, but we also provided technical assistance that would sort of reinforce the capacity of the institution and also raise awareness, build capacity of the various stakeholders. In addition, also create an enabling environment for the institution. And in so doing, training policymakers and ensuring that they develop bankable and sustainable green bankable projects that can support Mongolia in achieving their NDCs and their objective towards a low carbon climate resilient development pathway. You know, Mongolia is one of the very vulnerable countries, and the capital, Ulaanbaatar, has a very high pollution level, and really reducing their carbon footprint in this energy efficiency sector, particularly in housing and the business sector, is critical. And we did provide equity, concessional financing, and also the grant for capacity building and awareness raising. So this has been replicated in other countries, but this was a very successful intervention in Mongolia. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this experience in Mongolia. Very, very insightful for us. Moving on to you, Paul. What are some sustainable finance instruments that can be created to achieve the SDGs?
Thank you. So look, I think there's been a lot of work recently on blended finance vehicles, and BlackRock has also been hard at work setting up a new strategy called the Climate Finance Partnership, which we are in the process of putting together, which brings together development banks and philanthropies and institutional investors in an innovative structure that allows institutional investors who might not normally finance emerging markets clean energy to do so, because it offers them exposure to that market, but at levels of risk which are more like OECD levels of risk. And what we found is that if you take the time to structure such vehicles and allocate the risk in the appropriate way, you can actually get very high levels of leverage of non-concessional, purely commercial capital to invest in markets which they might not have invested in before at quite good ratios, 4-to-1 ratio in our case. So we're very excited about that. And the thing that I think is challenging is it is hard to scale blended finance vehicles. They take a lot of time to structure. They need to be designed around the particularities of different investors. And so while they are promising and important and give investors exposure to new markets that they haven't been in before, hopefully building that familiarity that then causes more business to flow, these sorts of structures are not themselves a scalable solution at a planetary level, which is why I emphasized green investment banks earlier as innovative financial vehicles. Because what green banks allow you to do is to have the host country have some skin in the game by capitalizing such an investment bank. But then it offers, I think, the GCF also a wholesale model for injecting concessional financing or supporting low carbon investment in these countries rather than project by project or program by program. And if it's a commercially minded organization that understands local risks, works with local commercial banks, these institutions can be very powerful catalysts for changing the landscape of green finance in countries. So I think we're looking with interest at the more than 24 countries that are, I think, at this point in the process of setting up green investment banks. And I think those that get farther ahead will probably be more interesting locations for private capital to participate.
Paul, thank you very much for this insight. What about emerging markets or even Africa, the African continent? I mean, it's difficult to start with a green bank. So what would you say about the first steps to put in place in these countries?
Yeah, well, you might be surprised. You have green investment banks in formation already existing in Southern Africa with DBSA, in Rwanda, in Uganda, and probably others since I last checked in. So green banks are not all made the same. The point is that you're creating dedicated financial capacity in a country that is not just a fund for spending grant equivalent financing, but is an investment fund that's trying to apply some of the same principles that the private sector facility does of minimum concessionality to trigger large-scale change. But it is, as I said earlier, I think it's inherently difficult to try to create a plan for driving the decarbonization of any country from the outside using a stream of some combination of concessional and non-concessional public funding or even FDI, right? For reasons of both scale and ownership, what you want is to root the solution in the country's own strategy and circumstances. And often there are a lot of resources that need to be activated that is like getting commercial. Let me give you an example. After the end of the Cold War, the IFC and the EBRD went into Eastern Europe and worked with commercial banks in Eastern Europe to teach them how to do energy efficiency lending. And those banks didn't know how to do that. And what they needed was a combination of loan guarantees and capacity building to learn how to do energy services companies and do things like that. You can do that to some extent, but in doing it in every country of the world is difficult. If you've got a locally rooted green investment bank or a regional green investment bank that can work with local commercial banks, speak their language, I don't think I think you'd be surprised how many markets that model can work in.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Last question for Eric. Taking into account all that has already been mentioned, Eric, is there something you would like to add?
I mean, I think I share Paul's views in terms of, do we need to think about, we have a lot of actors who are ratcheting up both in the public and private sector. And a lot of it is, how does this dance work? Because the reality is that the commercial motivations are there. It makes sense to get started, but we also know there are significant challenges. And in the private sector, they'll often refer to the data challenges. What exactly is a low carbon transition, or how do we, resilience and how exactly do you do it at scale? So I think this dance between public and private is really key. I think as the idea about blended finance, certainly in the idea of sharing risks and sharing opportunity, in the economist terms, absolutely. Of course, the devil is in the detail then. One of the net zero alliances, the oldest one, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, they, as part of their overall decarbonization strategy, it starts with engagement as their biggest focus. But then they realize that at the end of the day, they might need to do other things, including divestment, but also that climate solutions plays a role. And they realize, as they need to ratchet up climate solutions, that they need new platforms, including blended finance platforms. They are a little bit different because normally it's been public sector who's gone out to look, let's create a new facility and let's see the interest in the private sector. Here you have big investors like Allianz in Germany who are saying, we want to put capital into emerging markets because we believe that's how we're going to partly drive our overall emissions reduction. But we need facilities. And therefore, they did a call in February of this year for blended finance, where they basically said a group of major investors totaling $4 trillion of investment, who today are already allocating 4% of their portfolios to climate solutions. So that's $160 billion roughly. And they're saying, so we're doing a lot, but we could do a lot more. So they issued a call to asset managers to basically say, if you can propose blended finance facilities, we've got the private capital you need. Of course, you need to propose something that brings in the public capital. So it's turning the tables. But I think it's showing that this dance is not one waits for the other. It's, each side needs to take moves and to raise ambition, to ratchet ambition together. I think this thing about the Paris Agreement, countries ratcheting ambition, really applies also to the relationship between public and private.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. I think we're coming to the end of this session. We still have some questions for you. I just received them, so I will read them with you. Sustainable finance solutions are gaining policy attention, including through a new green finance initiative. What is the role of finance in the zero carbon transition? I suggest I read the 4 questions, and then you will choose each one you want to answer. The second question is how climate change risks can be accounted for in such developing country like Azerbaijan if the responsible investment concepts are not introduced. Question 3. Domestic financial systems of developing countries such as the Philippines are not as transition ready as those in developed countries because of geopolitical volatility. What is the best way to prevent green investors from skipping the Philippines? And question 4, how prevalent is the use of scenario analysis for climate risk estimation, especially in the Asian region? We just received a 5th question, which is how feasible is a green bank in the Caribbean? But let's say, how feasible is a green bank in any country, you know, especially in an emerging country? Has any work started in this regard? So who wants to start answering the question?
Lamia, I can answer the question on scenario-based risk analysis. I mean, we've just, as I said, we've just put out a report on this very question. Among the members of the NGFS, we've got currently 30 central bank and supervisors that are either concluded, are in the process of implementing such exercise or planning it. And among these 30, I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 6 of them coming from Asia, from Southeast Asia. So I think pretty much the same take up for that kind of exercise that in other places in the world for sure.
Thank you, Jean. Who wants to follow up? Maybe Paul? Oh, yeah, Eric, go ahead.
Well, I would just say, I mean, I think one of the frustrations on the private sector side is the uncertainty in terms of political commitment, and we have to understand it's difficult to get ambition. But I do believe that country NDCs are quite important tools, and obviously countries need to have the capacities to do them. But once they're doing them, they do provide a bit of a compass to the private sector to understand where the country's going. Of course, the science is even a more reliable tool that you can follow the emissions and you know that climate change is getting worse, and therefore there is going to be a policy response. And there is a piece of research called the inevitable policy response, which says that if you're in a market that doesn't have a policy response today, rather than saying I don't need to deal with this issue, it's actually a reason to pay more attention, because the later the policy response comes, the more brutal it's going to be, and there's going to be more stranded assets. And I think in general that applies to physical climate impacts. The more we ignore these issues, the more they double up in terms of the cost. So I think for the commercial financial sector, they need to partially try to understand the policy framework, and the NDCs obviously are a tool to do that. Signals from governments in general are certainly an important tool, but they also, and we're starting to see that they more and more are looking beyond policies towards science as sort of a longer term compass. And based on that, they're seeing the commercial rationale for why it makes sense to act today. And in their dialogues with their customers or their clients, they're able to then have a discussion on what does it mean for the buildings industry to actually start to embed this externality in terms of planning and how investments are undertaken. So there certainly is, it's a much more complicated set of steps than simply doing setting up a green finance department, which I think most actors have today, or doing the very basic. It's really about how do we totally change how we do business, which really means how do we change first, how do we get our direction from policy frameworks and even the science, but also how do we work in our relationship with our customers?
May I add to that? Excellent point. So I think that obviously it is a positive development that the financial sector has become engaged in the project of net zero, and the rise of these alliances that Eric and team have played such a big role in creating: net zero banking, net zero asset managers, net zero asset owners, net zero insurers, and service providers, is a very positive step. At the same time, the financial sector, and for us at BlackRock, we are involved in this work principally because we are concerned that climate risk is investment risk, and that we are a fiduciary to our clients. We manage $9.5 trillion on their behalf. It's not our money, it's their money, right? It's their retirements, their future that we are trying to safeguard and advance. And it is difficult to look at a future in which climate change accelerates that is good for our clients in any meaningful way, right? So climate change is bad for the economy. And also the transition to a net zero economy is an unprecedented project in human history, because we are trying to transform the global economy at a speed that it is not organically doing. And we've never tried to do that before. We've all seen lots of technological change in the course of human history, including in our lifetimes. But trying to execute the wholesale transformation of the physical asset base of the economy within a few decades, never been done before, and runs into all sorts of collective action challenges, which we're all trying to overcome right now. So, it's great that the financial sector is involved. It is also difficult to position the financial sector as the police in this to enforce net zero trajectories. That is not something that can be successful by itself. It's something that ultimately will depend on policy and other factors. So this is why, as Eric mentioned, it's so important to keep an eye on the scenarios that the NGFS and others have produced that show the costs of delaying, because even though it's true that we've already passed the temperature above which transition risk is preferable to physical risk, okay? However, the longer that emissions bump along at the same level, the steeper the inflection curve becomes to have a hope of hitting net zero by 2050. And that discontinuity is itself a risk. And the prospect of that discontinuity and the stranding of assets and workers and communities that comes with it will generate more opposition to making that progress. So we all have a role to play in smoothing this transition and increasing the likelihood of its success.
Yes, Jean?
Lamia, if I can just on the back of what Paul just said, I think it's a very important point. I mean, the scale of the macroeconomic challenges in front of us, and that's the reason why, for example, in the NGFS community, the central bank and the supervisor, they all do believe that what they do with regard to climate change is, because of their mandate, not despite of their mandate, because such a tremendous changes is bound to have an implication for the way we operate and what we do. That being said, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the success of the transition rests on everybody's responsibility. Each and every one of us needs to be doing its own part in the transition. If the central bank were the only one to act, if the investor or the banks were the only one to act, I think the transition would not happen anyway. So we see that we need both the financial sector to grasp with these issues. We need the policies to be in place to smooth the transition, and we need maybe one last part, the firms and the household to take the right decision, to be aware of the challenges and to shift their investment patterns.
Thank you. We still have this question 5. Paul, what do you think about the green bank? How is it feasible, the feasibility of a green bank?
Look, there's a great group of organizations that are working with developing countries that are exploring green banks. And also in the case of the Caribbean, the Inter-American Development Bank has done a lot of work on this too, because I think it's in the Latin American and Caribbean region that you see some of the most mature national development banks. And the difference between a national development bank and a national green bank is it can be trivial depending on the focus of that financial institution. So there's a green bank design platform that's in the process of being formed by a number of organizations I know, including RMI, NRDC, the Coalition for Green Capital, and a number of others. And its aim is to help countries that are interested in exploring this move it forward. So you can definitely reach out to them, and Leo's in touch with them. So the GCF, which has also seeded green banks in Southern Africa, Mongolia, and maybe other places by now, is a good center of expertise. But it's a process. You have to map out what sectors are you trying to transition, what sorts of financing structures are going to enable you to do that, depending on the infrastructure and the sector you're talking about and the circumstances of the country. What are the choices in terms of institutional setup and governance and capitalization? So I think enough countries and regions have gone through the process of setting up a green bank that there is a playbook, and there's lots of support out there, including from bilateral development finance institutions and agencies to help countries with the capacity building part of that process.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, for these insights. I see maybe Jean wants to say something, or no? Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, no, let me just add that I think the public sector cannot do this alone. We need the private sector, and this is where the policy and the regulatory frameworks are very key. And at our level, we are supporting countries to put in place the very strong institutional and regulatory frameworks to sort of create an enabling environment for the creation of the green banks. And as Paul indicated, we have worked in Mongolia and South Africa. We also work with IFC to see how we can strengthen the national financial institutions across the continents to bring in green financing. So this is work in progress, and we hope the results would replicate into other areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Pa, and thank you very much to all of you for your active and insightful participation. I think I'm speaking for everyone here when I say that we'll leave this conversation with a great deal of ideas and insights worth digging deeper. As the co-chair of the FC4S network, the Financial Centers for Sustainability network, I'm very, very pleased to witness the progress that has been made by your institutions. So let's keep in touch. I'm sure we will have more to share in a few weeks and months. And last but not least, I'd like to extend my thanks to Leo Park and the GCF for your invitation. Thank you, Leo, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Lamia. I'd like to again express my sincere gratitude once again to Luan, Eric, Paul, John, and Pa for making this session so rich and fruitful. And last but definitely not least, to Lamia for your excellent moderation. And I'd like to conclude by emphasizing that the GCF is here to help you, not only to bring in the financial system, but also to finance climate mitigation and adaptation projects across developing countries through our accredited entities. So please do not hesitate to contact us. Video recordings and presentation delivered throughout the conference will be posted on Hoover and later on the event webpage as well. So we'd like to invite you to visit our website at greenclimate.fund/events to learn about this event as well as other past and upcoming GCF events. We'd like to thank the organizing team at the GCF and also the interpreters who supported us today. Stay safe and goodbye.